So, Dickens' social change, it's not a big argument to say that Dickens is trying to get society to change with A Christmas Carol. That's obvious, it's blatantly obvious. The reason I put a little gif up there, when somebody please think of the children, is because the argument I'm going to go for is that the social change he's going for is all about children. That's what he cares about. Even though there's a lot of other stuff going on in Christmas Carol, Christmas Carol is about children, right? And that's what he's primarily concerned with. And so I'm going to have a look at that idea and have a look at how he particularly does that. So let's start with his intention behind writing the book. A little bit of background. Of course, always be aware that context isn't something that you want to blatantly repeat in an exam answer. It doesn't gain you marks, but it helps you to understand sometimes where he's coming from. When Dickens came up with the idea of writing this book, it started off as a pamphlet. Thank God he changed it, because I don't think a pamphlet would have been very exciting. An appeal to the people of England on behalf of the poor man's child. What happened was, as it says up there, there's an 1843 government report on child labour with interviews with children who worked, and particularly this was down in the West Country, children who worked in mines. And he was horrified by its findings, okay, and decided he needed to do something about it. So he's driven by the idea of young children. We are talking people about 7 or 8, that kind of time, being forced to labour for what sometimes was as much as 20 hours a day. Okay, it was a horrific situation. The 1840s were actually a very, very difficult time economically. They only nicknamed it as the Hungry 40s, and that's why a lot of child labour was produced, because obviously it's much cheaper to use in there. But in the end, what he decided to do was embody his arguments in a story. Therefore, what we can conclude is that this pamphlet, which was about the poor man's child, is what he was writing about when he wrote A Christmas Carol. And so we need to focus in, even though he's writing about Scrooge, a full-grown adult, we need to focus in on the attitude towards children that are within it. Okay, so let's start here with the idea of how he portrays the poor through there. So I put up here 6 particular examples of how he puts across the poor. And within these 6 examples, I think the focus we can see is children and the effect of it. Because I mean, think about it. And the idea is, it's all very well people being poor and starving, and you'll all know about the whole issue of the workhouses and the horrible way that the Victorians dealt with things, which goes with the poor laws there. But it's even worse when you're talking about people whose lives have barely begun, people younger than yourselves, being forced into these conditions. And that's what he goes for. Now, let's be absolutely clear before I go into any details here. Dickens was no socialist, okay? This is not Jamie Priestley here. This is not an Inspector Calls. Dickens was more than happy with people making money. We'll come back to that in a minute, right? What he did feel was that it was a social conscience was important. Okay, so the poor laws. Now they come up, of course, with the 2 portly gentlemen. Now, of course, the very fact that they are portly tells us immediately that they are wealthy. In the 1840s, if you have any weight on you at all, you are wealthy. Okay, you know, no cheap kebabs there to create obesity, right? You are. If you are large, you can afford to eat more than you need to move around. But when he addresses this idea, there's many things that they discuss about the workhouse and whatever. But I think one of the key things that the portly gentlemen say is this, that many talk about the workhouses, many can't go there, and many would rather die. Now, as so often happens with Dickens, because he's not subtle, Dickens, in any way at all when he writes. is essentially, I think this is Dickens speaking directly to us. Yeah. I mean, we know the workhouses, awful places. I mean, horrific. Not that many people got out here. You can look up the numbers if you like, but there were the high levels of mortality were awful in there. And of course, there wasn't really an easy way of getting out of it, because all you were doing was working long, hard days in very bad conditions where disease spread really easily, because I mean, most people just slept together in an absolutely massive room with just like a load of, mattresses, cheap mattresses laid out next to each other. So things spread around there. It was incredibly difficult to go through. But that is a direct confrontation. Obviously, Scrooge at the beginning can't cope with that idea, but later comes to understand it. And I think that's one of the things he's challenging us with. You still get it these days, don't you? People who, when told that people, people don't want to do that, they go, well, their problem. They don't want to do that, then they've got to part with what they have. You get that kind of an attitude, and that's what he's going there for. Now, soon after that, at the beginning, in comes the first actual child that we come across in the book, the carol singer. Now, many people remember the carol singer appearing at the door. Remember, he never actually comes in, unlike in all the film versions. He's only singing through the letterbox, basically, or through the keyhole, actually, I think it is. And we'll remember that Scrooge then picks up a ruler and chases towards the door, ready to beat him, which is pretty helpful anyway, and shows Scrooge's attitudes towards it. But far more interesting is the presentation of why this carol singer is doing what he is. And it's this quote, really. He's described as gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold, as bones are gnawed by dogs. A mixture of personification and a simile there. The cold being personified as a dog gnawing and mumbling away at people, and the carol singer as literally a bone. Well, obviously that relates to the fact that the carol singer will be very little more than bone, very little flesh on him at all. But the idea of the cold as some kind of predator, but especially as a dog, really, so it's not actually attacking for any other reason than its own survival. Cold does this. And we are literally opening up these young children to being gnawed and mumbled away, just literally by the cold. Now, of course, I'll come to in a minute, that comes back at the end very much. But then probably the most famous child of the lot, Tiny Tim, in with the Cratchits. Now, I think this might be news to everybody now. I don't think I've voiced this in front of any of you yet here, but I do regularly. I'll put my cards on the table. I hate Tiny Tim. I genuinely hate Tiny Tim. He irritates me horrifically, okay? To the extent that in stage 4, when, it's meant to be this horrible thing that Tiny Tim has died, I'm kind of happy because he is so irritated. But
Sir, he's a poor child. He's a malnourished child.
He's irritating. The whole thing, this entrance he has when he comes in, from church, and Bob says, "Oh, he was saying to me he hoped that everybody in church saw him, because if they saw a cripple, it might make them remember the one who made cripples walk." Oh, for God's sake. What an annoying child. Anyway, but we're not meant to think that way about Tiny Tim. And what he is an example of, and this is probably why he's so irritating to me, he's an example of something that Dickens uses a lot. This over-sentimental presentation of a particular child. Just throwing pathos at us, saying, look at this poor thing, look at it. He did it in so many other books. Apparently went down well with the Victorians, because a lot of them became very famous, the characters he created. And here is a perfect example. One of the things which is in another masterclass lecture I've done before on this, but I often think at a higher level you should pay a lot of attention to, is the use of the narrative voice. in this. The fact that there is actually a narrator who comments on the action. Okay, you know how in the Muppets Christmas Carol, by far the best version of it, in the Muppets Christmas Carol, they use Gonzo to be Charles Dickens, who narrates as he goes along, and that's because that whole structure works. There is a narrator who, on the very first page, starts commenting. Well, look, here is a perfect example. Alas for Tiny Tim. This narrative voice is coming in and telling us straight away, oh, this is so sad. Alas. Oh, it's so sad for him, unfortunately. And here we go. The little crutch, the limbs supported by an iron frame, the fragility of him attached to the tiny, nature of him as a child. Now, it's been looked into many, many times, and people think it's basically rickets he's meant to have, which, of course, is a lack of vitamin D, I think, isn't it? Often provided by the sun, which in a city in the poor areas would be quite a common thing, and with poor diet. So actually, you could see this as literally the fault of Scrooge that Tiny Tim is suffering this way. And therefore, creating this kind of over-the-top sentimentality for him is a direct attack on Scrooge and his like. Okay? The fact that they are causing this. Now, my next thing here is the miners. Now, a lot of people, certainly all adaptations, film adaptations, ignore this bit. And I think it's one of the most useful bits in the book. In Slave 3, Go to Christmas Present. Remember, this comes between the Cratchits and Fred, between those two Christmases. There's a succession of three groups of people that the ghost takes them off to sea. First of all, he takes them out to the middle of nowhere, which I assume is Yorkshire, it could be Wales, I suppose, to the moors, to where miners work. Now, or we will know as well as anybody how the mining conditions in the 19th century were horrific, because many of us in here will have been to the Black Country Working Museum, where they have those mines underneath that you can go down into, and they're very much preserved as they were used in the 19th century. And, you see the horrific conditions and the high levels of mortality there. You then get two lighthouse keepers who are forced to spend Christmas looking after the light, and some sailors out on a ship being tossed about in the ocean. But with the miners, who probably are, along with the people, the scavengers at Old Joe's, are probably the poorest people that we really come across in the book. The presentation of their Christmas is very much attached to childhood, once again. Okay? It's made very clear that there's generations, I think 4 different generations in that miner's house at that point, go right down to children, young children in there. And they are reliant on all of this. But this is where they're growing up. It's one of the longer pieces of description that he introduces. And again, it's a lovely piece of description. It's where Dickens' real talent for language comes across. But this idea of a bleak and deserted moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, this lovely simile, as though it were the burial place of giants. It's almost like some horrific place from mythology, isn't it? And water spread itself wherever so it listed, or it would have done, except for the frost that held it prisoner. And nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. So down in the west, the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye. And frowning lower, lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. That personification of the sun as glaring along what's already desolation with a burning red eye, as though nature is being even harsher upon this. And the simple use of lower, lower, lower as we go further down into the depths. It's certainly the portrayal of almost the worst conditions that we can imagine. And there are children suffering there. Now, of course, one of the points he's making is they're still having a great time in Christmas. You know, they're still enjoying that. But he's really pointing out to us their very existence. Then, of course, at the end of that section, we get ignorance and want. I'm sure you've dealt with in depth before. The key with ignorance and want, really, I mean, we know obviously they are very symbolic. Ignorance, remember, is not probably the way you would use ignorance. We tend to use ignorance these days as somebody who is like being a bit rude or unpleasant or whatever. But remember, ignorance in its literal meaning means unaware of something. But it tends to suggest happily unaware, as in you're quite happy not to know. And the ignorance of this situation is the ignorance of the wealthy, middle class, upper class people about the level of poverty. In other words, the ignorance about what he is trying to show us in his book. And in many ways, therefore, this moment is right at the heat of it. It's nothing really to do with Scrooge. I know he throws back Scrooge's arguments at it, but it's not really about Scrooge. It's about us. Because he basically turns to his audience and says, on ignorance's forehead is written the word doom. And if this doesn't change, then the end is coming. Right? The idea that things are going that particular way.
Oh, right, okay, thank you.
The idea is, if people remain ignorant, if they don't listen to the message that they are getting right now from Dickens, then their world will collapse. Okay? And he goes right over the top here. I mean, again, the description that's here, not only, I mean, it starts with, you know, suffering, but notice the idea of wolfishness, scowling, prostrate too. They're almost feral, completely losing social elements, yet he still suggests they're humble. And then what he goes on to discuss is the fact that their youth has not touched them. They have missed out on their youth. A sense that they lose that because of what's in there. Where angels could have sat, devils lurked and glared out menacing. It's the sense that we are taking these children and perverting their nature. And that's our future. And that is why this ignorance and want bit leads directly into stage 4. Because in stage 4, which really is nothing to, even though it's all that ridiculous thing of, you know, Scrooge not realizing when everybody else realizes that it's him they're talking about who's dead, even when it's blatantly obvious. It's not, again, stage 4 is probably the furthest away from Scrooge and Scrooge's story that we know, right? That we see. Scrooge 4 is a portrait of almost a dystopian world. Okay? A world in which ignorance has won out. A world in which we have, first of all, a bunch of city men who are, remember, physically repulsive. Remember those descriptions of those city men, right? The monstrous fat chin of one of them, the one with the excrescence hanging off the end of his nose like a turkey cock that wobbles around when he's there. The one who stands there, takes out snuff, which is sniffing tobacco, and while he's talking, starts going like that. They're gross. They are horrific. And it's Christmas, because it's Christmas everywhere in the book. And at Christmas, they don't show any awareness or any concern with Christmas at all. There is nothing close to it. They are revolting. They are repulsive. Then we have old Joe and his customers juxtaposed with them. Old Joe, remember, is this person who has this shop as it says, a lowbrow beetling shop where it's described again as something really horrific. It's a survival thing. He has a wall that is basically a bunch of rags hanging down to protect him from the cold. Look at the list of things. You know, Dickens and listing. Dickens loves a good list. The list of things that are lying around, that are traded there. Iron, fair enough. Old rags. People buy old rags there. Bottles. People buy bones. And greasy offal. Offal, remember, being the organs and intestines of animals. The bits that basically no one else eats. What's left? So the cheap bits, right? The cheap bits that are left. And then later on, it talks about masses of corrupted fat just lying on the floor in this room. Sepulchres of bones, as though it's a graveyard or a place that people are in put in. Even things like the heaps of rusty keys lying around. Obviously, this is to do with recycling metal, you know, and how that could go. But I mean, why would you have heaps of rusty keys? Rusty keys long not used, but why would you have keys? The only thing I can ever think of is that they've been nicked. Okay, and that's to do with people trying to get in places. So the whole thing is presented as awful. Now, remember though, in this situation, and it's not really dealing with children per se here, but this is an area in which children are living. What's described is the area is horrific. The area, not just this shop, but the area around it is awful. Okay, it's described as in a way that it's quite repulsive. But the people aren't repulsive. The people are just surviving. And what they do, which so shocked Scrooge, you know, scavenging from a dead body, I think is presented to us, if you look closely at that section, as necessary. As something where we look at it and go, well, to be honest, if I was in that condition, maybe that's what I'd do as well. The worst one, the woman with the bundle, who ends up basically, the worst she's done is she's taken the shirt off the back of the dead body while it's lying there dead and replaced it with a cheaper shirt. Another thing is, well, why waste that shirt? Burying in there. No one cares. No one cares about him. And we kind of sit there and go, well, actually, she's got a point. It may offend our sensibilities, but she's kind of got a point. It's a dystopian world where the poor are driven to those levels, okay? While the rich stand there repulsively and do what they need to, okay? And then, of course, the Cratchits are mourning Tiny Tim's death because in this dystopian world, he can't survive. This is where we're heading, and that's the point that Dickens is making. If we do not change, then that's what we're on our way to. So this is the poor that's there. I mentioned the rich, the elements of them there. But what's important for us to notice is that his portrayal of the rich, and I mentioned before how Dickens is no socialist, it portrays the fact that there is nothing wrong with being rich. Now, I'm dividing this into the good rich and the bad rich, and I think that's how he sees it. There are a number of people in there who are rich, and he is more than comfortable with it. But what do they have in common that makes them good? Generosity. They are generous. They are ready to embrace and use their money elsewhere. So we've got the portly gentlemen who are at Christmas going around raising money for the poor. They're still rich themselves, they're portly, right? They're not giving up all their money. They're just seeing it as their duty, because they're well off, to go at Christmas and get things for other people. Then we've got Fezziwig. Again, Fezziwig, who is also described as plump. So again, they're making the point that he's wealthy, he's a successful businessman. But Fezziwig, who on Christmas Eve, at the end of business, notice, not instead of business, at the end of the business day, shuts things up and starts a party to which everybody's invited. And there's that, again, listing, that long list of people that starts with his family and ends up with the boy over the road, going further and further down in importance, and they're all welcome. But even then, it's made clear he's only spending a few pounds. I suppose for us, a few £100 maybe, or something like that, right? He's only spending a small enough amount really to have this happen. It's the generosity of spirit that's important. Not giving up all his money. He's not stopping from being a businessman. He's there. And then Scrooge at the end, when he changes, he doesn't give away all his money. He doesn't suddenly become a monk, right? And go and live and meditate and change his life. No. What does he do? He goes around and he becomes generous. He donates that turkey to the Cratchits. Okay? He donates a huge amount of money, we don't know how much, but it shocks them, to the portly gentleman. He goes to Fred. And again, he's generous with his time and his love and his spirit's there. And he gives a raise to Bob Cratchit. The change in him is generosity. And that's what makes the rich good. You can be a rich man as long as you're generous. And that's the social change he's going for. When you look at the bad rich, you see the opposite. Marley, what we hear about what Marley says about what he was like when he was alive, how he didn't care for Christmas. He didn't pay any attention to other people around him, right? He was a good businessman, Scrooge says. He says, mankind was my business. Scrooge before this, who again, and remember this is the key thing, he's not just rich, but one thing that's identified all these rich people so far is their size. But Scrooge isn't. Scrooge is tiny. Scrooge is thin and bony. Because the whole thing with him is he hoards money. He doesn't spend the money. Remember that whole thing about him keeping his house dark. And then the city gentleman we mentioned as well. All three of these are not interested in anybody else. And they're not interested in two key things as well, which Dickens is therefore attaching to social change. And here comes our children thing again. And that is Christmas and family. Look at that thing on the side. The good rich all celebrate Christmas and enjoy Christmas. The bad rich pay no attention to Christmas at all. The good rich are all associated with family. I know the portly gentlemen don't talk about family, but they are talking about the ability of the children to have family. And certainly Fezziwig's family is at the heart of what he's doing. And when Scrooge changes, one of the key things he does is he goes to family. I mean, one of the mess ups in so many adaptations of The Christmas Carol, you know, is how at the end they want to have him, because they think the Cratchits are much easier to sell. They want to have Scrooge finish off at the Cratchits and have his Christmas lunch there. But that destroys the entire thing. The point is, no, absolutely. He helps them enjoy. They're their own family. He ends up with his family. It starts with Fred coming to him and saying, come and spend Christmas with us. In the second stage, he's reminded that this is the only family member he has left, the son of his beloved sister Fan. And so at the end, that is where he heads back to when he changes. But the bad rich have no family associations whatsoever, or never, no mention of it in the slightest. So at the heart of social change, that's what we've got. And you can tell this from stage 5. Remember, the purpose of stage 5 is to bring stage 1 back to the beginning. Stage 1, certainly the bit in the counting house. Everything that happens in there comes back at the end. Like we just said, Fred comes and asks him to lunch, and he dismisses it to Christmas lunch, and he dismisses him and says to him, Christmas, what a waste of time. What an idiot word to get married. And at the end, he ends up spending his time there and learn that is exactly what he should be doing. The portly gentlemen come in, and of course Dickens brings them back at the end, having dismissed them at the beginning. And actually, if you remember at the beginning when he does this and dismisses them, at the end of it, it says very clearly when they leave, and Scrooge, it says, feels better about himself for what he's done. He's like kind of well chuffed with himself for the way he's just won his argument with the portly gentleman. idea. But when he goes back and meets them again at the end, the portly gentleman, he sees them, he's going to go and speak to them, and it describes how he feels nervous about it. He feels awkward about it because of the horrible things he said to them. But he realizes it's something he has to do. And those are little bits that don't need to be there in a small book like this, but they're there to show that this is hard and difficult, and he has to do difficult things to change. The next person we see, of course, is the carol singer. Now, the carol singer can't come back, even though a lot of film adaptations do it, because it just would be a bit awkward. So instead, what we get is, what for the better term, the want of a better term, I'm calling there the turkey boy. Basically, the boy that he shouts out the window to and gets to go and take the turkey. Pair that up with the carol singer, having chased one with a ruler, this one, and remember, this boy is actually a little bit cheeky to him at one point in it, okay? And he just laughs and goes, "Oh, what a little scamp you are," you know? He takes it all on board and enjoys that. And then, of course, we get Bob Cratchit. Bob Cratchit at the beginning, asking for a time off. At the end, getting a raise. At the beginning, he thinks he's picking his pocket by having time off, and now it gives him more money. But there's two other things I've mentioned up there that are important in the conclusion. One is that Scrooge goes to church. Don't miss that. This isn't a particularly religious book, but Scrooge goes to church. Right? It just brings together the sentiment underneath the Christian. Okay? And the whole thing that at the end, he becomes a second father to Tiny Tim. The man who was going to turn Tiny Tim away. Now, remember, it's that key moment when he sees Tiny Tim, when he sees the Cratchits in there having their dinner, he can't take his eyes off Tiny Tim. And he wants to know if he's going to survive. And at the end, he is directly responsible for making sure that he survives. So stave 5 shows you what the conclusion to all of this needs to be. Church actually actively taking care of the poor, changing your attitudes like he does to the turkey boy. So, what I'm arguing therefore is, yes, children are at the heart of this. But all we need to do is look at the structure to see what social change he wants and how he wants it to happen. It's not really that he sat there going, the whole country needs to change in terms of the government or anything like that. He's talking to his audience. His audience are not poor. They are not working class. Because they wouldn't be able to read, for one thing. His audience are middle class. His audience are potentially wealthy. And he's talking to them and he's saying, show some consideration for children. Especially if they're starving, treat them, look after them. He gives him a £1 note, doesn't he, or something in there. Be generous. Give to the poor. Take those Christian sentiments into your heart and do what you can to help others survive. Okay, I hope that gives you an idea of something that in a difficult situation can actually be tough to talk about, really. Okay, so thank you very much.